would think there's a difference between dying from COVID and dying with COVID.
He didn't die of COVID, he died of colon cancer.
We dig into how Oregon is reporting COVID deaths and if it's accurate.
So based on that criteria, if someone were to test positive, 10 days later get into a motorcycle crash, they die, but they had COVID, that will be listed as a COVID-19 death.
Right.
And we tried to get an answer from mayoral candidate Sarah Iannarone on this question about the nightly violence in Portland.
Do you denounce that part of it?
I understand why they're angry.
But lighting fires with people inside the building, would you denounce that part of it with lighting fires, arson with people inside buildings?
I'm not the person setting the fires.
Here's the story. All right, what a way to start a Friday. Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Haggerty. Welcome to the story. I don't want to waste your time here. I want to get right into our first story tonight. But this is kind of that part of the show where I tell you how everything works. This is where I tell you that I want you to talk to us, that I want to hear what you think of the show. I want to hear what you want us to cover. I want you to send us emails at thestory@kgw.com. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, or use Twitter and that hashtag HeyDan. See, was that a waste of time? Don't answer that. There's no time. Let's start the show. All right, and let's get right to this big story, okay? And the way that we count COVID deaths in Oregon and the difference between dying from COVID and dying with COVID. If you ask the state, they're the same thing. Now, Kristen Severance has been digging into this for us, and based on your Twitter messages, Kristen, people I think are pretty anxious to find out what you found out.
Yeah, we knew that would happen. So this came into the Verify email. A guy wrote me saying, look, I heard from 3 different medical professionals that even if you would die, say, in a motorcycle crash and you had COVID, that would be listed as a COVID death. And honestly, I thought that he was wrong, that he was mistaken. But I reached out to the Oregon Health Authority, and it turns out the man who emailed us was right. And some family members are saying that that's not right and it's misleading.
81-year-old Fred Creasy was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at the end of June. Doctors gave him 30 days. The Newport man died at the end of July. He was in hospice care at Avamere Rehabilitation Facility in Newport.
You better come down here because we give him, it's going to be today.
Daughter Rhonda said Fred had also tested positive for COVID around the same time of his cancer diagnosis. He was asymptomatic and tested at Avamere before a medical procedure.
But I mean, he had no symptoms. He wasn't even quarantined.
To the family, their dad died from advanced cancer. In fact, Avamere considered Fred recovered from COVID. But a few days after his death, Lincoln County Public Health reported him as their 9th COVID death. They now have 10 deaths.
I mean, that's not what he died from. He died from colon cancer, not the COVID. And places are listing, loved ones as COVID deaths, and they're labeling that, and it's just not true. And I think they're overinflating numbers, and, I just feel sorry for all the people that are listed COVID death.
To Rhonda, Fred died with COVID, not from COVID, and there's a difference. But in Oregon, I learned the state counts both as a COVID death. The Oregon Health Authority considers COVID deaths to be, quote, deaths in which a patient hospitalized for any reason within 14 days of a positive COVID-19 test result dies in the hospital or within the 60 days following discharge, or deaths in which COVID-19 is listed as a primary or contributing cause of death on a death certificate. According to the OHA, they do this because COVID can have a major impact on all sorts of health problems and to track the spread of the disease.
But I had questions. Remember, the state said any reason. So if a person died in a car accident, from alcohol poisoning or a gunshot wound and had COVID, would that be considered a COVID death? Well, according to the OHA, the short answer, yes. Here's OHA spokesperson Jonathan Modi.
So based on that criteria, if someone were to test positive, 10 days later get into a motorcycle crash, they die, but they had COVID, that will be listed as a COVID-19 death.
Right, it would be. But again, I have to go back to the point about how we use this data, which is to help us track how COVID-19 is spread in the community. So that's a huge factor. And we are using Centers for Disease Control and Prevention guidance in tracking and reporting deaths this way.
Epidemiologists like Dr. Carlos Crespo with the PSU OHSU School of Medicine said this is not misleading. COVID exacerbates other health problems.
So all these chronic diseases that normally you might or might not die, but the fact that you contracted COVID-19 put you over the edge. No, I think it's reasonable. There might be a case when these two things do not make sense, like the accident or gunshot or something. But for the most part, the reasons people are dying from these chronic diseases that they had were augmented by the fact that they contracted the virus.
Dr. Pyle Coley, KGW's medical expert, agrees. She explains a principle in medicine, which means the simplest explanation is most likely the correct one.
So if you want to be very conservative, then the right thing to do is anyone who tests positive for COVID and dies, gets hospitalized, or has a bad outcome, you want to say that's from COVID. Now, the criticism from doing it that way is that, number one, you're not obviously counting the deaths correctly. And number two, a lot of people are saying that hospitals may be doing this in a cynical fashion to try to get more money because they're being reimbursed according to how many COVID deaths we have. But I think in totality, we are underestimating the number of COVID deaths because the CDC has said that for every one case that we've diagnosed, there's likely 10 out there that we haven't diagnosed.
The Oregon Health Authority does not receive federal funds based on COVID deaths. Some facilities may receive some money based on Medicare reimbursement. But remember, Oregon has less than 400 deaths. We're not seeing the thousands of deaths in places like Florida, so the financial incentive theory isn't as relevant in Oregon. Let's get back to how states track COVID deaths. This same thing happened in Colorado. State health officials were counting people who died from COVID and with COVID as the same thing. There was so much backlash, the state changed how they reported COVID deaths in one day, separating them into two distinct categories: died from COVID and died with COVID.
So as a clinician and as a physician, that kind of a classification makes a lot more sense to me, because then we've got more granularity on the data and we know exactly who is directly related to COVID, whereas who may have just died while being infected with COVID.
We don't have 1,000 deaths a day. I mean, total in our entire state, there are 386. So, I mean, as a scientist, as someone who deals with data, wouldn't it be relatively easy to create that subcategory? If you just have 386 deaths, couldn't you separate the two? These people died from COVID, these people died and tested positive for COVID.
Yes, so this becomes more challenging when the number of cases goes up. But if you have 386 deaths, it is much more straightforward to try to classify who died with COVID and who died as a direct result.
The Oregon Health Authority has no plans to change their system or separate deaths into two different categories. Rhonda hopes they reconsider.
I just think if somebody goes, you get hit, you're in a motorcycle accident, you died, from injuries from a motorcycle accident, not COVID. And just like the 1,000 people that died that day in Florida, they're calling it all COVID deaths. So nobody died of a heart attack, nobody died of natural causes. They just all died of COVID in one day.
All right, I do want to point out, we interviewed the family of a 26-year-old man who was listed as a COVID death. We interviewed them yesterday, and his COVID test came back negative. So, Dan, there are other families, across the state really questioning how their family members were listed or why they were listed as COVID deaths.
We have some viewers questioning our report here, Kristen. We've been getting a little bit of pushback from some people. I want to read a comment from Facebook. This from Tammy Diney. She said, "Great idea. Fuel that idea that this virus is not as bad as everyone's making it out to be. Excellent, responsible choice." Wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Sensing some sarcasm. Look, if you've watched even 10 seconds of any KGW newscast since March, you know that we know how serious COVID is. This is not about that. This is about how the state is tracking and reporting COVID deaths, and if that is the most accurate way to do that. And that's what this story is.
Got it. Kristen Severance, thank you. Now let's stay on the pandemic topic here for just a moment. I want to read another question that we got from Tim on Twitter. Hey Dan, Dr. Brinks has Portland on a watch list of 10 cities that may very well be in trouble, but she hasn't said why. That's it. Have you heard anything about this? So Dr. Deborah Brinks is on the White House Coronavirus Task Force. And yes, she did name Portland as a virus hotspot during a recent conference call, according to the Center for Public Integrity. Now, as to why we're on that list, turns out Multnomah County's top public health doctor doesn't know why. And she wasn't part of that conference call either.
She mentions Portland in that list, and she refers to high levels of virus. And it's really not clear what she means by that. Again, in Multnomah County, our percent positive is right around 5%, which is sort of the threshold for when you start to worry. And we know that our cases, our running cases per 100,000 are actually quite a bit less than many of our peer counties across the country.
My producer telling me I mispronounced Dr. Birx' name. I called her Brinks. Dr. Deborah Birx is the doctor we're talking about with the White House. We should also mention that Oregon Health Authority is telling us that the spread of the virus is slowing in Oregon, and it looks like the infection rate has come down, at least for now. All right, let's talk about one of the other once-in-a-generation stories happening right now. The protests. See, at this point, they've been going on for more than 70 straight nights. Last night, you might remember, we heard from the mayor. He said that he supports the movement, but not the violence. In one case, the mayor said it was the equivalent of attempted murder, some of the stuff he was seeing. Last night, we saw the chaos continue. Now, I called on people and leaders to make that distinction between the protesting and the violence and asked them to speak out about what they think. So we look for the responses from city leaders and those vying to have the job of mayor. Here's Maggie Vespa.
To those outside East Precinct, this gathering has been declared an unlawful assembly.
Protests and also violence in Portland played out once again overnight at the Portland Police Bureau's East Precinct. Our cameras spotted a fire in a trash can, and police tweeted out this photo of a woman doused in paint. The story behind that in a minute. Police said in a news release, people in the crowd spray painted and tore down security cameras and threw large rocks and fireworks at officers. That in mind, based on what we saw and on what police said, things last night didn't escalate quite as much as they did the night before. A night that prompted the mayor and police chief to hold a news conference and basically say this.
The attack was immediate, it was intentional, and it was planned. I believe that city staff could have died last night.
Wednesday night, police said protesters tore down boards from the precinct's windows and used them to lock 20 police officers inside East Precinct. Then police said they used accelerant to try and set fire to the building. Police fired tear gas to break the crowd up and put the fire out. Last night, Portlanders showed up to guard that building, including a woman with a walker who was holding a Black Lives Matter sign. This video of her was shot by Zane Sparling with Pamplin Media Group. According to police and multiple reports, people in the crowd doused her with paint. Police also said they feared that fire in the trash can could have caught the building on fire. Today, KGW reached out multiple times to every sitting city commissioner, Joanne Hardesty, Chloe Udaly, and Amanda Fritz. None of them joined the mayor, police chief, or Portland Fire in denouncing the violence yesterday, and none of them has gotten back to us today. One person who has spoken out, the mayor's opponent in the November election, Sarah Iannarone. She appeared on this week's edition of Straight Talk with Laurel Porter, an interview taped Thursday afternoon. She's attended many protests for Black Lives Matter and against police violence, and she's an avid critic of the police.
Protests are an important part of a healthy democracy just as much.
But what about the criminal activity we're seeing? Do you denounce that part of it?
I understand why they're angry.
But lighting fires with people inside the building, would you denounce that part of it with lighting fires, arson with people inside buildings?
I'm not the person setting the fires. I'm not the person doing the graffiti.
But will you denounce it?
I'm not here to tell them how to protest.
So you won't denounce it?
Smash windows. I clean up when things are unfairly targeted, but here's what I have to say. Their outrage at the police is valid, and the problem of police brutality and executing Black lives in the streets is more important than petty vandalism.
Today, Ayanna Roan's campaign sent us a statement. It reads, in part, criminal activity is illegal, and of course I don't condone it. What I'm focused on is ensuring police do not use violence and even lethal force against people who have done nothing wrong. It went on to say, I condemn arson. Obviously, I also condemn the countless deaths of Black individuals at the hands of police. Maggie Vespa, KGW News.
Now I want to talk about another person running for mayor. No, not Ted Wheeler. There is a write-in campaign right now for Teresa Rayford, the founder of Don't Shoot PDX. You might remember the name. She came in third in the primary. A lot of you voted for her. She was right behind Ayanna Roan with about 8% of the vote. She does have a lot of supporters, and we've gotten a few questions about her campaign, like this one from Elizabeth. Hey, Dan, do the rules change for what it takes to get elected for Portland mayor? Asking because a third candidate is running as a write-in campaign, and I can't find anything on the city website. So the answer is all a write-in candidate has to do to get elected is get more votes than the other candidate on the ballot. It's really that simple. But just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. Multnomah County Elections told us that they are unaware of any write-in candidate ever winning the election. But here's an interesting little tidbit for you. If you misspell a write-in candidate's name, we learned, it still counts as a vote for that candidate as long as it's close to the correct spelling.
We're doing everything we can to make this place much more accessible for everyone.
Things are starting to open back up, but that doesn't mean the crowds are pouring in, especially at the Portland Art Museum.
It would be an absolute disaster for this place not to be here.
When the story continues. Hey, welcome back. Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. I'm reading some tweets and everything you guys have to say using that hashtag HeyDan, and you're saying a lot. Send us an email, too, or you can find me on Facebook. Now, I want to talk about something that's pretty important next week. Oregon lawmakers are meeting for a special session. I know, yes, again, another special session. They already had one last month to pass a bunch of police reform bills, but now they have to tackle the budget, which, of course, is necessary for the state to actually function. They were supposed to pass one earlier this year during the regular session, but you might remember Republicans walked out over cap and trade and almost nothing got passed. But now, here we are, in the middle of a big economic downturn, and Oregon's facing a more than a $1 billion shortfall. So a lot of stuff has to be cut to try and fill that hole. The proposal on the table is cutting $387 million across state agencies, and they want to use $400 million from the state's Education Stability Fund to give to schools. Lawmakers might also take up some more police reform bills to add to the ones that they passed last month, things like expanding bans on tear gas and chokeholds and requiring officers to display their name and badge number on their uniform. They've been working on these bills since last session, but we don't know if they're actually going to be brought up again. Governor Brown says that she's open to that, but Republicans do say they should focus primarily or only on the budget. The special session starts Monday, so of course we will keep you posted on all of this. You probably noticed a couple of the murals that we were showing, highlighting before and after the commercial breaks. Those just always grab my attention when I'm downtown. They're huge, they're beautiful, and they're some of the best I've ever seen. I came from Texas, a lot of you know that, and if you're familiar with Dallas, there's a neighborhood there called Deep Ellum, and they're known for their murals, and they're great too. You can look them up on Instagram, and while they are great, sorry Texas peeps, I know a lot of you still watch me online, but they got nothing on Portland. I mean, this city is known for its creativity and its open minds and its artistic expression. And if we're not careful, a pillar of that identity could be taken from us because COVID-19 has places like the Portland Art Museum in its crosshairs.
What I find is that you need pillars in a community. You need a great hospital, you need a great library, and you also need a great art museum, which we think we are. We're one of the oldest west of the Mississippi, and we have one of the best collections of any museum in the United States. And what we like to think is that we bring Oregon to the world, and we bring the world to Oregon.
Okay, how about that sales pitch? Not bad, pretty convincing, at least they hope it is. This is a look inside the Portland Art Museum downtown, and I'm wondering what's catching your eye. How is this video speaking to you, as they say in the art world? Maybe you see all the wonderful pieces by Robert Colescott, a fabulous and controversial artist whose work drives the discussion about race and culture. Or maybe you notice that there's almost no one there looking at them. COVID guidelines have nearly crippled the museum. They have to limit the number of people that they have inside. They forfeited money from the CARES Act because they stayed open during the onset of the pandemic. They laid off 60% of their staff, dropped their budget from $18 million to $12 million, and they're still $2 million in the hole. It's gotten to the point where we really have to imagine the possibility of the Portland Art Museum shutting its doors.
It's dire in that we want to be here. We want to be the place where people come to rest and recuperate and rejuvenate, but we need funds to do that. We need people to know that we can't continue to operate this way. We can't continue to only have 100 people in here an hour and make this work. Normally we would have 200, 300, 500 people within that same period of time. So, I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but it doesn't take much to understand that that's not a sustainable way of doing business.
I'm not a mathematician either, but I can do a little bit of math. And to be clear, the 100 people an hour that he mentioned there, that includes staff. So it's actually more like 80 guests per hour. And even if they met that mark every day, every hour, they would still be losing money. So they dropped the price of admission. It's $10 now to get in, and it's free for anyone younger than 18. They have social distancing guidelines in there, but as you can tell from the video, it's pretty easy to stay away from other people. They're asking people to consider a membership too, and you can find all that information on their website. You can also find tickets for these drive-in movies that they're showing on Portland's South Waterfront. They partnered with the Northwest Film Center. Those started last night with sold-out showings of the John Lewis documentary. In fact, most of their movies that you can see all the way through September are sold out. Shockingly, The Great Outdoors is not, which is a Candy Aykroyd classic. And now that I brought it up, I'm probably going to watch it this weekend, but I think you should check it out. Now, before we move on, I do want to address something that I'm sure a lot of you are thinking. Doesn't the Art Museum have a massive endowment? Didn't Arlene Schnitzer give them like $10 million a little earlier this year? Yes, that's true, but that money isn't really sitting in some Scrooge McDuck type vault. There are financial restrictions on how that money is spent, and most of it can't go to operations or keeping people employed. All right, we're going to read some of your comments coming up after this commercial when we finish the story. We'll be right back. All right, I'm having one of those moments at the end of the show where we're getting so many comments, I'm almost overwhelmed. So I just want to talk about the overall tone of some of them. We have a lot of people who are happy that Kristen's story ran earlier and made that described kind of the difference between dying with COVID and dying from COVID and how the state is lumping both of those together with the overall count of COVID deaths. Some people have been very upset about this, feeling as though we're trying to change a narrative or have a certain opinion on this. Our opinion is on the facts and the data. And I'm going to say something that I told somebody else on a comment earlier today. How would you feel if we learned this information and kept it from you? That's not what journalists do. That's not our job. I'll end with this comment from Serious Fun 555 on Twitter. This is talking about Kristen's story. This is the worst piece of crap I have ever seen on this show. Can I just say, that's saying something. We appreciate you being with us this week. We appreciate you being with us tonight and always. Have a great weekend. That's the story. I'll see you on Monday.